It was one of those quiet, late nights where the streets are nearly empty and the only sound is the hum of my car's engine. I'd been driving for Uber for a few hours already and things had been pretty uneventful. Just as I was about to call it a night, I got another request, this one from a guy standing at a dimly lit corner in an area I wasn't too familiar with. When I pulled up, the man was standing alone, wearing a dark jacket and looking a little out of place. He didn't say much, just nodded politely and got in the back seat, giving me an address several miles away on the edge of the city. The ride started off normal enough. He sat quietly in the back, barely speaking, which didn't bother me much. It was late, and people are usually tired by this time. But after a few minutes, something weird caught my eye. As I glanced at the rearview mirror to check on him, I noticed something off. I couldn't see him. His seat was empty. I blinked and adjusted the mirror, thinking maybe the angle was just wrong, but no matter how I shifted it, the back seat remained empty in the reflection. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was probably just the light or my eyes playing tricks on me. I didn't want to freak out over nothing, so I kept driving, trying not to look at the mirror again. We drove in silence for about 20 minutes, the city giving way to quieter, more desolate streets. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke up. "Could you make a stop? Just up ahead, at that corner," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I looked at the GPS. There wasn't a stop marked, but I figured it wasn't too strange for someone to make a last-minute request. When we reached the spot, he mentioned it was even more isolated than the rest of the area. A desolate, dark stretch of road with nothing around but a couple of old buildings and overgrown lots. He stepped out of the car without saying a word, leaving the door slightly ajar as he disappeared into the shadows. I sat there, waiting, checking my phone and hoping he wouldn't take too long. After a few minutes, I glanced at the back seat to make sure he hadn't left anything behind. That's when I saw it. A photograph lying on the seat. I picked it up, and my blood ran cold. It was a picture of my car, taken just a few minutes ago. The angle was unmistakable. It had been snapped from the sidewalk, showing me sitting in the driver's seat, looking straight ahead. But here's the thing. The photo wasn't just of my car. It was taken from the outside, as if someone had been standing right there as I pulled up to the curb. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I looked around, but the street was completely empty. The man was nowhere to be seen, and I hadn't heard anyone take a photo when I'd stopped. The unease grew into panic. I checked my phone again, realizing that no part of this ride felt right anymore. When I went to the Uber app to see how much longer I needed to wait, the trip details were gone, vanished, as if the ride had never existed in the first place. I didn't wait around to see if he'd come back. I locked the doors and sped off, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. Who was that man? And how did he get that picture of me? I never saw the passenger again. But every time I get a request late at night, I still glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another passenger who isn't really there. It was around 11 p.m., and I had just decided to take one more fare before heading home. The app pinged, and I got a request from someone not too far away. The passenger's name was Jay. There was no profile picture, which isn't all that unusual, and the pickup spot was in a dimly lit area just off the main road. When I pulled up, there was a man standing there glued to his phone, barely glancing up as he got in the back seat. He didn't say much, just nodded when I confirmed his destination. I asked him a couple of casual questions, where he was headed, how his night was going, but he didn't seem interested in chatting. Fine by me, I thought. Late-night rides are usually quiet anyway. About 10 minutes into the ride, things started to feel strange. The guy was sitting unusually still, staring at his phone with a furrowed brow, not scrolling or typing, just staring. Something about it put me on edge, but I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he was just tired or having a bad night. Then, His phone rang. He stared at the screen for a second, looking genuinely startled, before muttering something under his breath. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and he looked shaken, almost scared. He answered the call but didn't say a word, just listened for a few seconds. His face grew paler by the second. Before I could ask if everything was okay, the light ahead of us turned red. Without warning, the guy threw open the door and bolted out of the car, running into the darkness. I shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He didn't even glance back. He just disappeared. Confused and more than a little freaked out, I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My first thought was that something serious must have come up, but why wouldn't he say anything? Why run? That's when I noticed it. His phone was still on the back seat. I reached back, picked it up, and my stomach dropped. On the screen was a notification from Uber. Your driver will arrive in 5 minutes. Wait, what? I was his driver. I had already picked him up. The pieces started clicking together in my head, and a cold chill ran down my spine. If he was waiting for his driver, then who the hell was in my car? Before I could process what was happening, my own phone buzzed in the front seat. I glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number calling me, the same number that had just called the guy in the back. My heart started racing. I hesitated for a moment, then swiped to answer, unsure what to expect. A voice, low, steady, and chilling, came through the line. Wrong car. The call disconnected. I sat there in stunned silence, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. I looked at the passenger's phone again, still unlocked on the back seat, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My only thought at that moment was to get out of there. I drove home in a daze, replaying the events of the night over and over in my mind. When I got home, I checked the trip history on the app, expecting to find the ride. But just like the guy who vanished, the ride was gone. No record of it. No trace of the passenger. To this day, I still don't know who that man was, or why he ran. But one thing's for sure. Whoever or whatever was in my car that night wasn't supposed to be there. And every time I think about that voice on the phone, I get the same cold feeling. It was a regular Saturday night, and I was out driving for Uber, trying to make a few extra quid. It had been a slow evening, just a few short trips around the city, but it was getting late, so I figured I'd do one last ride before calling it a night. The request came in just before midnight, from a quiet residential area on the outskirts of town. Nothing unusual, just another rider trying to get home, I thought. When I pulled up, the guy was already waiting at the curb. He was tall, average-looking, maybe mid-30s, wearing a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. He climbed in the back without saying much, just muttering his destination. It was an address I didn't recognize, but my GPS picked it up as being a few miles outside the city. As we started driving, I couldn't shake this odd feeling. The man was polite enough, but there was something about him that seemed off. Maybe it was how quiet he was. He just sat there, staring out the window, barely moving. I tried making small talk, but he didn't respond, so I gave up and focused on the road. The further we drove, the more rural the area became. Streetlights grew sparse, and the houses started thinning out until we were driving past nothing but dark fields and patches of dense woods. About 20 minutes in, right when I was starting to get that feeling you get when something's not quite right, the guy suddenly spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Take a left up ahead. It's a shortcut. I glanced at the GPS, and there was no left turn coming up. The road he was talking about wasn't even on the map. Instantly, I felt uneasy. I didn't want to go down some dark, unfamiliar road, but I also didn't want to make a scene. Maybe he just knew the area better than the GPS, I thought. After all, it was late and people just want to get home faster, right? So, against my better judgment, I took the turn. The road was more of a dirt track, rough, unpaved, and barely wide enough for the car. It snaked through thick woods, and with each passing minute, the trees seemed to close in around us. The farther we went, the less I liked it. My GPS signal had cut out completely by now, leaving me driving blind in the middle of nowhere. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, trying to gauge the man's expression, but he just sat there, staring straight ahead, his face emotionless. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke again. This time, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "but this is the only way out." I froze. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I could feel my heart racing. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. He wasn't staring out the window anymore. He was staring directly at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face was completely devoid of emotion. But what really set me off was his hand. He was reaching into his coat, slowly, deliberately, like he was pulling something out. That's when the adrenaline hit. I slammed on the brakes hard. The car skidded to a stop on the dirt road, and without thinking, I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning as I backed up as fast as I could. The man didn't say a word. He just sat there, his hand still inside his coat, watching me with that same dead-eyed stare. When I finally made it back to the main road, I didn't even bother looking back. I sped off, heart pounding in my chest, and kept driving until I hit the city limits. I never got his name, never saw his face in the app again. And the next morning, when I checked the trip history, it was gone. Like the ride never happened. I still think about that night sometimes, about what might have happened if I hadn't turned around. And every time I pick up a late-night passenger now, I can't help but wonder, who's really getting into my car?